Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-Futurism. Welcome back, listeners. You are, as always, receiving our broadcast from the King Charles III space station.
And wherever you're tuning in, whether you're travelling on a train, walking in a public park, or sitting on a loo, you are probably benefiting as we speak from British inventions.
The same goes for me and Tom. Without the white heat of British innovation, our space station would have no Chesterfields for the two of us to lounge on, and no warm ale for us to quaff as we recline by the fire.
It is hard to imagine a world without thatched orbital pubs, but were it not for Isambard Kingdom Brunel's pioneering launch in 1844 of his local boozer, there would be no King Charles III space station, and perhaps no space stations at all.
Today's guest wants the Brits of the present to act with as much vigour and creativity as the Brits of the past. Sam Dumitriu of the campaign group Britain Remade has just co-authored a plan to get this country building again. It's called Back to What We're Good At, and it's bursting with practical ways in which Britain can rescue herself from her deep economic morass.
Sam, welcome to the KC3.
Thanks for having me.
Onto the show. Listeners, you're about to hear how progress will come down on Britain like a ton of bricks. It's time to grab your spades, fire up your kilns, and get your cement mixers rolling.
Get in, losers. We're going building.
Sam, in Back to What We're Good At, you and your colleagues write that the modern world was made in Britain. Tell our listeners what you meant by that.
If you look back at our history, Britain has a really proud legacy of inventing and, crucially, building things. So we invented the steam engine, we built the first railways, we built the first coal-fired power stations, we split the atom, we built the first nuclear power station. I think that legacy is responsible for making us much richer today than we once were. And I think what's the problem is with Britain today is we've kind of turned away from that. So we still invent lots of things. You know, we invented the vaccine for COVID at Oxford. We invent lots of great breakthroughs in AI. But we kind of stopped building things. You know, we haven't built a nuclear power station for almost 30 years. We haven't built a reservoir in more than 30 years. We need to get back to building again, because otherwise, you know, there's only so long we can rely on the inventions and the building of the past, right? The roads, railways, sewers.
Which are creaking, right? That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we are very lucky that we had the Victorians who just built lots and lots of stuff, right? Loads of great houses, loads of great sewers, loads of reservoirs, railways. The problem is today, we haven't really been continuing to build things. And as a result, we're getting to a point where it feels like a lot of our infrastructure isn't fit for purpose. And I think we need to change that.
And we're going to come back to this question of how Britain can return to building stuff rather than taking advantage of what our forebears built. But Callum, I can see you bouncing up and down in your Chesterfield because you a serious enthusiast, are dying to explain what Britain did so right.
No, I you know, Tom, that I love whenever sewage gets mentioned, and it's a thing that people don't often think about. The sheer beauty and majesty of the fact that when you dispose of your waste, it goes elsewhere.
And these beautiful unseen civic cathedrals under our feet.
There are cathedrals everywhere if you've got the eyes to look.
If only you descend into below the manholes.
Below the manholes.
Callum has done a master's in sewerage. This is why we're skewering him in this fashion. Sam, now that we've endured Callum's hectoring about sewerage, perhaps you could share one or two of your own favourite examples of great British building.
Well, I think Calder Hall Nuclear Power Station is something that I think is a very proud legacy for Britain. So it was the first full-scale commercial nuclear power station. So there were test nuclear power stations. There's one in Russia that was very small but was connected up to the grid just to prove a point. But it's the first proper one that actually, you know, people could power their ovens and roast chickens from, you know, that, like a proper nuclear power station. When that was opened, Queen Elizabeth II opened it.
Forever in our hearts.
The Lord Privy Seal at the time was also there at the opening, and he
said
he
was a sewage guy.
He said that this could be, you know, from 1965 onwards, we could only be making nuclear power station. The idea of building a coal or a gas-fired power station would be absurd Now, that prediction didn't come true. We did manage to build another 10 more in the decade or so that followed. But one of the things that we're interested in at Britain Remade is why nuclear power costs so much to build in the UK and why other countries seem to be able to do it better than us. So when the late Queen opened Calder Hall Nuclear Power Station in Cumberland, the Lord Privy Seal was there, and he said something quite interesting. Now, this was 1956. He said, maybe after 1965, every new power station being built will be an atomic power station.
And look how we fell short of that goal. What was it, though, about the Victorians and the generation, the Edwardians, that made them such good builders? Like, what was it that they had that we have maybe lost?
We probably have learned a lot of great lessons from them, and they're just sort of in the water. But I guess one thing they didn't have to deal with is the sort of restrictions that you get from the planning system and controls on development. I doubt the Victorians building the first railway lines had to fill out a 10,000 plus page environmental impact assessment, for instance. The government has this program called the Restoring Your Railway Fund, where you can bid in and you get a bit of money to take one of the lines that were killed by beaching in is that the 60s?
Yeah. A date that should be etched on every true Briton's heart.
Forever in our hearts.
And you can take these old lines and they'll give you a bit of money to restore them, and you can run trains along them again. Now, there was one that went from, I think, Bristol to Portishead. You would think to bring back a railway line wouldn't be the sort of thing where there'd be lots of planning issues. Fundamentally, a lot of this stuff has been built. The land is already set aside. There are no big debates about the route. You've got the route already. But actually, to do this project, which again is an environmentally friendly project fundamentally, it's encouraging people to travel by rail, which is much lower emissions than driving. They had to fill out something like an 18,000 page environmental impact assessment as part of an 86,000 page planning application. And this is to reopen a 3.4 mile railway line.
And this was, I imagine, to protect the local red petticoated populations of children or other such endangered species.
I think, I presume, because Portishead is quite a nice seaside thing, it involved some seabirds, which is typically is what causes the trouble, but I've not got the specifics, although I think we might be posting a blog shortly, which will cover the details in greater depth.
Rage bait, I think, is what they're calling it. We've been resting on our laurels here. We've been reveling in these tales of grand daring do, of rapacious building, and the builders that carried out these projects. But today we're looking at a very different country now, aren't we? I mean, I asked you this before, but maybe say it more explicitly. What is different? What have we lost?
I think it's just become much, much harder to get things built in Britain. And there are lots of reasons for it, but I think the most important reason is the way our planning system operates. So in order to get anything built, you have to first get permission from government.
So this is not a case of they will stop you, it's that actually you have to ask in the first place.
Exactly. I mean, you could try, but then they will stop you for certain. And what happened as a result, to get any form of infrastructure built, you have to go through quite a lengthy process. If you want to get houses built, you have to do lots of bureaucracy. And this is only on the land that councils have actually said, this is where we'd probably like some housing. There are lots of bits of land where development would be really great and would have lots of benefit, where developers don't even bother applying because they know they'll never get permission.
And these are areas of fields and areas of beauty that people want to protect.
It could be lots of different things. It could be farmland by a train station, but it could also just be
prime location, right? For
10
houses.
Minutes into central London or whatever sort of places. But it could also be a high street near a tube station or near central London, where you only have 2-3 story houses, and instead 4 or 5 would be much more justified by the location. And because of all of this, it's meant that Britain's sort of become more and more reliant on our engineering heritage, and it's really starting to have effect. So a lot of things we want to do are very difficult at the moment because getting a grid connection, hooking yourself up to the power grid is very, very difficult because we haven't built enough pylons, enough substations. We built the national grid in, I think, 5 or 6 years. You add in a couple more years for when they decided to actually connect them all up with a switch and a bit of time for legislation. But that's about as long as it takes today to get permission to build a single grid line. And, back in the day, they didn't have to deal with quite as many planning objections and complaints coming in.
And the power demand was much lower, right? There weren't all the gizmos and other, widgets that people that were drawing power.
It's not just that the power demand was much lower, but also the kind of way our economy works now is much more complicated. So we used to just have a few coal power stations around the country, and you could kind of wire everything up, understanding that you've got your population centres here, you've got your big forms of generation. Now, because generation is much more decentralised with renewables, we need a lot more wires to make sure they're all connected up, and that when the wind blows and the turbines turn, that power actually goes to somewhere useful, rather than the situation we have at the moment where we actually pay offshore wind farms money to stop generating power because we can't send it anywhere.
Because otherwise, and it'll overload the grid.
Exactly.
And we're like a sort of metaphor of a sort of young boy in his children's clothes and sort of growing and squeezing out of them. Because obviously, as a population, right, we've grown a lot, and yet the infrastructure hasn't grown to accommodate that.
Well, tell us why this matters. What difference does this make to our day-to-day lives that we can't build?
I mean, you could look at housing, for instance. So because we haven't built, I would say in 70 years, enough homes before we brought in the Town and County Planning Act in 1947. We used to add around 2 to 3% of the housing stock each year. In a few years we hit that, but that was kind of in mad housing booms that then weren't sustainable since then. And so as a result, we're left with the oldest housing stock probably in the world. I say in Europe, but I can't really think of places that would have older housing than the housing stock of Europe.
So it definitely is Europe. We are the oldest in Europe.
Yeah, the oldest housing stock. And if you go to London, we have an even older housing stock than the rest of the country. And that creates lots of problems because how old a property is the biggest predictor of how much a property emits, how expensive it is to heat. So it's bad for the environment to have lots and lots of old properties. We also have very, very small properties because population has grown, where people want to live has changed. So back in the day, people would be happy to live in a suburb quite far outside of London. Today, people want to be in the city because that's where the job opportunities are in a world where people are doing, all sorts of creative industries and things like that. So again, we're much more tightly packed in. So we're packed in the tightest. We have the oldest properties at the most expensive to heat. And despite all of that, we still spend more than pretty much any other country in Europe on housing.
We're paying more for much less.
Exactly. And that creates sort of two problems. First of all, people have less disposable income, which means they can't spend them on the things they want to, which is a shame in itself. But it also means that some people just say, well, I'm not going to live where the best job opportunities are because all of the extra pay I get will just go on rent. And I'd much rather live in a much bigger house and have kids and have a driveway and spend a bit longer in traffic than going all the way into a city where all these great job opportunities are, which again makes the country poorer.
We're lucky, Tom, that we're up here in space where
we are economic refugees from London. It's cheaper for us to live and work here in space. That's why we did it,
and spend all of our disposable income on beer.
And down on Earth, this stuff really matters, doesn't it? Because people spend decades of their working lives trying to afford an entry-level house. They then pay the fourth most expensive energy bills in the country. They put off having families because they can't afford homes because there aren't enough of them, and they might not be able to live in London as it is because the transport system is so underfunded that only a very small portion of the country can get into work.
Well, and we see this, right, in that women and men are both consistently saying that they are having fewer children than they would like to have because it's It's too difficult.
Yeah, the planning system. Well, how much does it have to answer for, Sam?
I think it has to answer for a lot, but where I might differ with you. You talk about transport being underfunded, but one of the things we find from our research is that in many areas, not all areas, but in many areas, Britain pays to build a given line of train or a given line of given tube line or a tram or all sorts of different transport infrastructure, a lot more money per mile of track. And now I think part of this is down to planning. So, for instance, if you go, there's the Lower Thames crossing, which is a new river crossing that's proposed to make it easier to get from Kent to Essex, where we have lots of ports. Because currently we have the Dartford crossing, which was meant to relieve traffic, but has itself become overloaded as the population has grown, as demand for freight has grown, etc.
And anyway, this is a road connection or a rail?
This is a road connection.
Road connection.
And I think the tunnel itself is 2.4 miles long. There's a bit of road on either end. But to get that planning permission, and planning permission is yet to be granted, we were meant to get a decision actually, I think within about a week and a bit, but that has been shunted due to the general election. I suspect, given it is a very large infrastructure project, we won't get a decision like the day after the general election. It'll probably be delayed further.
Into the weeds.
And that single project had a 365,000 page planning application. The environmental statement alone, I believe, was something like 60,000 pages. This isn't factoring in all the design work and stuff like that was done, that's been spent on the Lower Thames crossing already. This is just the planning work. So we sent a freedom of information request to National Highways, and they had spent £297 million on preparing that planning application.
Without a spade going into the ground, without a brick being laid, without concrete being poured.
A spade may have gone into the ground because sometimes you have to do archaeological digs for road.
Oh, okay. So
metaphorically,
nothing larger than a trowel. How about that?
I think actually you have to do quite a big. You need to do quite big digs first to get to the trowel level. But yeah, let's but metaphorically without a spade.
You've now
literally maybe not.
This is the Anglo archaeology podcast now.
Yeah. But to do a project like that is going to cost a lot of money. I mean, that's already more than it costs Norway to have built the world's longest road tunnel. In fact, Norway built the world's longest road tunnel and the world's deepest subsea tunnel for the same amount of money as it cost for us to get one wing of the government, National Highways, to persuade another wing of the government, the Planning Inspectorate and the Department for Transport, to give them planning permission.
I don't know, this might be a chauvinist and patriotic point, but do the Norwegians not have an environment? Do they not have the same problems?
They do, but they don't have as many people living near the environment, I suspect. They also have hardened rock. So I think that explains why they can do it for less than 300 million. But the fact that the planning application itself doesn't eat up 300 million must help. Well, it wouldn't be possible, would it, to build it for that much?
And I imagine Norway is not a country that hates its environment. So why can they do it and we can't?
Maybe one thing to think about is the input we give people in the planning process. So there are fewer people in Norway. It's a much sparser country. So there are fewer people who need to essentially be bought off in some way. Now, there's this really interesting study in the US that looks at how highway costs have risen over time. And one of the things they find is that ever since the 70s, where there was a really big movement for citizens' voice in the development process, in part because a lot of infrastructure projects were being proposed that weren't very good, building motorways through the middle of our great cities, for instance, and destroying the East Village and that sort of thing.
Well, that was where a lot of it in England as well, in London, right? That they stopped the huge great ring roads of...
Exactly. And I think on that, what you find is that over time, by accommodating more people's objections, roads have become wigglier. And every increase in wiggliness leads to an increase in costs. Now, I think the precise term used in the paper is tortuosity. But I think it's something like a 1% increase in in tortuosity links to something like a $9 million increase in costs for a given section of highway. I'm not sure how long that exactly is.
And that doesn't even include then the additional petrol spent from people driving further, I imagine.
Yes. And when I say wiggliness, I don't just mean the road goes all up and down, but there's also other things.
Listeners, Sam is moving his fingers backwards and forwards.
This is not a visual medium, I'm afraid.
Show us the camber.
But it's not just, the road sort of going left and right and up and down and all sorts of things. It's things like digging down and tunneling so that people don't have to deal with as much road noise, or having green walls to cut down on noise pollution, for instance. Now, some of these things are good, and some of them are clearly a good way to design roads. But what has happened is that we accommodate so many of them, and we don't have a really good way of assessing when the costs outweigh the benefits, that our road projects now and our transport projects are a lot more expensive than they need to be. And if you look at the Lower Thames Crossing, one thing you'll find is they have this lovely website, which is how we've changed the project in response to your consultation responses. And it's like, hang on a minute, they've spent a lot of money additional to respond to this, what people have written in. And I suspect in a lot of cases, they'll have written in and tried to pick as many holes as possible. But deep down, they just don't like the idea of there being more traffic going to their end rather than in Dartford, where all the traffic's concentrated at the moment. And I think that is a real problem.
And what on earth is actually in this 60,000 page report, the environmental report?
So I think it's important to think about what we're doing with environmental assessments, because it's typically not actually helping nature. So Britain is a very nature depleted country. A lot of key biodiversity indicators are in decline, and lots of money is spent on environmental impact assessments, but that's not the same as nature recovery. That's not the same as mitigating things. It's to inform the planning process over whether to approve or deny things. And in a lot of cases, it's all a bit pointless, because we are probably going to approve that offshore wind farm in the end. But in the meantime, we've produced a environmental impact assessment 5 times longer than Tolstoy's War and Peace. Lots of money has been spent, and the project hasn't been delivered as quick as we would have liked, which means we burn a lot of fossil fuels, which actually is bad for the habitat we're trying to protect in the first place. We'd be better off, and this is something we talk about in Back to What We're Good At, is if you created a sort of central pot that people could pay into, that the government would then use to target particular species that are in decline, might be restoring new habitats, creating new habitats, or restoring existing ones. It might be investing in other projects that have positive environmental impacts. That, I think, would be a much better approach. And it's something that's being tried for offshore wind, because the government has committed to tripling the amount of offshore wind we produce by, I think, the end of the decade. It might be by 2030. One of the problems at sea is it's very hard to protect a specific species or particular habitat, because things move about a lot. The sea's always moving, birds are migrating.
It's one of the key distinguishing features of an animal, right?
Exactly. And unlike land-based issues where you can kind of say, well, we know those badgers live there and they're probably not going to end up 500 miles away. So for that, you kind of need a strategic approach where you say, look, we realise that offshore wind as a whole might have some negative impacts, but it also has a lot of good impacts. And to deal with the negative impacts, we're going to get the whole of the offshore wind, all of the offshore wind projects to contribute to a wider solution. And that's good for the developer, because they don't have to deal with all this bureaucracy and they can just spend the money with a much higher degree of certainty. But it's also good for nature, because more money gets spent on helping animals rather than making lawyers even better off than they currently are.
I mean, so what I'm hearing is you're suggesting having all the money going into pot, and then having a sort of Chessington world of adventures for animals rather than the low-level collapsing high streets in terms of animal habitats.
Isn't the Chessington world of adventure for animals Chessington world of adventures? It is, after all, a zoo.
Well, there we go. We'll upgrade Chessington world of adventures to be the ultimate rare bird and migratory bird
Much
centre.
less glamorous animals than
You're turning
what you normally get
Chessington
in a zoo.
into Longley.
Just like water rats having a lovely time.
What's the Anglo-futurism view on Longleat and the late Lord Bath?
Oh, we think we should be bioengineering even more exotic megafauna, perhaps of the mythic kind that adorn our heraldry, so unicorns and such like.
I actually want to see giant rodents again. So I think I'm really sad that things like giant sloths died out. I think we should have mega badgers and mega beavers. That way
You've never seen a mega beaver.
they would build the dams and infrastructure for us. As long as you could engineer them, not just to hate the sound of running water and build dams, but hate the sound of a car turning left and right, and it could build a road straight through a mountain.
Oh, we could have moles as well.
Moles as well. There you go.
That can go through our soft rock.
And Sam, what has caused this? Is it the fact that we are more nature loving than any other nation in the world? That we care more? That the old people are resentful and they want to ruin the country going forward? What's causing this?
I think it's a combination of things. So we are a denser country. While London is not particularly dense, the UK as a whole is quite dense. So it's much harder to build a massive railway line and only go through about 5 people's houses, which you can do in sort of parts of Spain, but you can't really do in Britain. So that has an effect. Our planning system itself has an effect because of the way it rations development and how hard it makes it to do sort of negotiations.
But the planning system is a function, right, of the people that made it and the people who came up with it. Who are the people behind it? Whose incentives is this planning system meeting?
There are elements of Nimbyism in the creation of the planning system, but it's also the sort of planning system Britain chose compared to other countries. We have a much more of a discretionary based system rather than one that kind of says, look, this bit of town, you can build up to 6 stories. Are you building 7 stories? No, that's not allowed. We'll step in. 6 stories, fine. That kind of thing. We take a different approach, which is like, is this, 5-story project absolutely necessary? We will investigate that deeply. And then we'll give you a decision at some point after a lot of money has been spent on lawyers and community consultations and all sorts of things.
Which is strange, right? Because it seems at odds with our characterization as a liberty-loving people.
It's much more in line with that. I think it was a YouGov poll that said that 20% of the population would happily ban nightclubs on COVID grounds. And I think that poll came from 2023.
That they loved the restrictions and wanted them kept in, didn't they?
Yeah. So I assume there's elements of that, but part of the problem is that there would be ways of buying off opposition, or there'd be ways of making benefits better shared that don't exist under our current system. So one thing you might do is, in London, for instance, if you were to build a new big tower block, that should be paying very large property taxes for a very long time. But in the UK, it will be council tax, which is pretty low and typically based on prices in 1992.
91, isn't it?
Let me say it, 91, 92, 93, 1990, and you can just fill that in.
The recording will go, it was in 1990.
And because of that, while a relatively big house in somewhere like Texas might pay quite a lot in property taxes, a house that's maybe 10 times more valuable in London will pay a lot less. So there's less of an incentive to say yes. And because the way we ration planning consent so much, it means that it's very easy for people to object, and their objections can have a lot of weight when really they might actually be okay with it, or just trying to block it. Or there might be a route where everyone could be made happy, perhaps if you just paid them a little bit of money.
I suppose it becomes a sort of reflex action, doesn't it? If you get into the habit of blocking things,
Exactly.
the muscle is stronger. That is tested often, but it can't all be bad. Sam, what strengths do we retain in this country? What are we good at? What is the lodestar, the North Star the pole star to which we can return or aim at?
The UK does do a lot of good things. It's got a lot of good accomplishments, right? We gave 3 in our plan as things that, show what we can do when we both are willing to build things and also, stick with our sort of pioneering, inventing spirit. So the weapons that Ukraine used to defend their freedom are made in Northern Ireland. They're designed by British companies. The vaccine that saved millions of lives around the world, a vaccine that, by the way, is much cheaper than the other vaccines that were available, so had a really big impact in the developing world, designed in Oxford, built, manufactured in the UK as well as other places. And if you look at the offshore wind sector, now Britain needs to build a lot more offshore wind if we're going to hit our net zero targets. But we have built the world's largest offshore wind farm in Dogger Bank, and we're in the process of building an even larger wind farm off the coast of Yorkshire, and I think another one off the coast of Norfolk. There are lots of good projects in the works, and we have done some impressive things. The problem is, to make up for that sort of deficit of building over all these years, we really do need to get building.
Right, I suppose that these are impressive despite the restrictions, and actually imagine what could be possible were it a bit easier.
Exactly.
Okay, well, we've heard an awful lot about Britain's current plight, but perhaps we can move into some areas where we can improve, and we'll start with nuclear energy. And Sam, you are no mere SW1 dwelling policy wonk. You are a gonzo policy wonk. And this means that you can tell our listeners who Big Carl is. Who is Big Carl?
So Hinkley Point C, a nuclear power station under construction in the southwest of England. We visited it relatively recently. And one of the cool things we saw there was Big Carl, which is the largest land-based crane in the world. It's either the largest or the most powerful. I think power is more the metric, because
it's what I look for in a crane.
It's not really. There are taller cranes, I think, maybe,
but it's how you use it.
But some of these cranes are all mouth and no trousers.
So this crane, which was used to sort of lift in the reactor dome and drop it on top.
So that's a huge concrete thing, right?
Yeah, that's a very, very big concrete. So it's capable of lifting 5,000 tons. That's big. And that's really powerful.
Listeners, that is 5,000 elephants.
I don't know if there's a metric or imperial tons. Whatever's most
is that
impressive.
an African or an Indian elephant ton?
Big Car's really impressive and really cool. But
nothing to scoff at.
Yeah, it's good. But fundamentally, Hinkley Point C stands out because it's the most expensive nuclear power station under construction in the history of the world. So
it's that record-setting attitude that we love.
So it's going to cost about £42 billion. Now, on a per megawatt basis, that's around almost £13 million per megawatt. And if you look around the world, which we have, so we built a database that had every single nuclear power station built since 2000 with reliable cost data, which meant that we cut about a couple of Russian projects out, because part of the issue is it's very hard to do the comparison when it sort of changes on a monthly basis. You could say that about the pound the other year, right? A bit of Ian Hislop sort of satire, that, isn't it? But I think it's about 40 or so projects. And one of the things that stood out is that when Britain builds nuclear power stations, we do so at a much higher cost than other countries. South Korea, which builds quite a lot of nuclear power stations, can build them for a sixth on average of the cost of us. So I'm very interested in trying to figure out why South Korea can do things much cheaper than the UK, and maybe even make it easier for the South Koreans to come over and build a nuclear power station here, which they did, by the way, in the United Arab Emirates, which was more expensive than what they built in Korea, but you might expect that given it's Dubai and wages are very high in Dubai. There are lots of...
For some.
I feel like for nuclear engineers, they may be quite high. They have a reputation for very, very large construction projects.
But Big Carl is still bigger than Big Mohammed, who was working there. We'll cut that out.
No, I love it.
Sam just gave me a look like.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's Big Carl the Crane, right? So
Big Carl the Crane. Okay.
Big Kareem would be more like it. Or something more C or K based, I think.
I do want to talk about the cost of the energy, because this money doesn't come out of the ether, right? This means that taxpayers pay more tax. It means that energy users, which is all of you listening, pay more for your energy bills. Like it really is important that power stations can be built cheaply.
Exactly. And with something like Hinkley Point C, the way we kind of dealt with the risk of these construction overruns is gave them what's called a contract for difference, set at very high cost, so that our bills are much higher as a result.
And what is a contract for difference?
So that's essentially saying we will buy this power from you in the future at 150 megawatts, or not 150 pounds per megawatt, or something like that. I'm not sure the exact figure in the end, but let's just say it's much higher than what we maybe not what we paid a year ago or a year or two ago, but definitely more expensive than what we pay now.
So it's a big subsidy, basically.
Exactly, to deal with the risk. We have a slightly different system that's a bit more sensible, I think, but still there is a real risk of construction costs eating into things. Now, if we could get it down to Korean costs, we could build a lot more nuclear power stations. We could hit our net zero goals much quicker and bring down bills.
I'm detecting a theme here, but Sam, please talk us through, why is Hinkley Point C costing us so much?
So one thing we find is that with nuclear power stations and kind of all major infrastructure projects, the more you do of something, the better you are at doing it. And there's a few reasons for that. One, when things are repeatable, you learn from your experiences, you don't make the same mistake twice. But also you can build up a supply chain, you can build up that base of skills. And now, one thing that's a problem with Hinkley Point C is that it's a FOAK, a first of a kind nuclear power station. And the problem with that is there is a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty. Now, it shouldn't be a first-of-a-kind power station. The reactor design, the EPR, has been used in France, it's been used in Finland and China. But when they put their reactor design, EDF did, to the Office for Nuclear Regulation, to comply with the standards that the Office of Nuclear Regulation set, it required making around 7,000 design modifications. We have a slightly different approach to regulate. We're not necessarily more or less stringent, but just to comply with our standards that are slightly different to other countries' standards, because we're much more of a, other countries would say, you should use this much metal. We'll say, you should use enough metal to be able to avoid this specific problem, which you might think would not cause much trouble, but it does in practice. So those 7,000 design modifications meant that a lot of the lessons that could have been applied from France or Finland weren't applied in Hinkley. And it also meant that we use around 25% more steel or concrete. So immediately that's driving up costs. But on top of those design modifications, to comply with nuclear safety standards, environmental regulations meant that Hinkley Point C had to do a lot more to protect fish.
Well, because we wouldn't want to fry them, would we?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are degrees of complexity. So obviously with a nuclear power station, you have basically all forms of power that maybe, except for wind and solar, is basically boiling some water, then using the steam to spin a turbine round.
It's an oversized kettle, isn't it?
Kind of.
A radioactive kettle.
I think the important thing is, though, that for this story is that you need a constant intake of water to cool things down. Now, this coolant water never actually goes into the reactor. So this is like a big myth that people worry about, that you basically have loads of water going in and then it comes back out.
Out come the three-eyed fish.
It doesn't work like that. But this water, when it comes in, some fish might be in that water. They might go through a very hot bit of the sort of route and then get cooked. Now, some of those fish might be protected, and that would be a serious problem. So to avoid this, they have developed this, I think it's unique to the world, fish return system, so that just before they get into the really hot bits of water, the fish are sort of picked out in various ways and sent on their way.
Why can't there just be a filter, like a fish filter?
Yeah, and when you say picked out, what, like a robot arm reaches down and grabs them? Because I can think of a lot of anglers who would be very excited to hear about this kind of innovation.
I think it's somewhat like a filter. I would encourage you to Google the specifics. I don't want to stand by a particular design description that I can't back up. But
Or we could just say, Sam is now showing us a picture and it's great. And
so you have this system, but on top of that, and part of the point of the fish return system is, even if you can try and filter them out, but also you can then put them back into the water, because even a dead fish is quite good for other fish, because the other fish can eat the dead fish, and that kind of gets the circle of life going.
And what do fish prefer? Other fish raw? Would cooked fish not be not? I would say that actually the other fish would appreciate some of their cooked brethren.
Well, people like fresh sushi, don't they?
God, we've got some picky fish.
But that's one aspect of it. But then on top of that, and what we're looking at is the remaining fish. We're looking at saving potentially 1 year's worth of trawlers catch, and then of that trawlers worth of catch, maybe 100 or so that actually meet protected standards. And to deter them from even entering the system, because the fish return and the sort of filters and all those sort of things get rid of most fish from going in, but some will get through. To avoid that, there was initially a bit in the planning application that said they should install an audio deterrent system, which essentially is putting speakers underground, and they play sounds that fish don't like.
What sounds, Sam, do you think fish
play
don't
some
like?
bad music?
Yeah.
Is it the Jaws theme or something? I recently had a starling trapped in my chimney, and it's very clearly about to come out of the fireplace. So I put my phone next to it, and actually I put a speaker, and then I'd connected to my phone and was playing hawk sounds to kind of scare it back up. Eventually it came down, and it was a very stressful half hour.
Actually, it was one of the most pugilistic starlings that you've met. It was actually raring to get up against the hawk.
But I assume there are various animal sounds or various things that make a fish go, I don't really want to go over there. But the problem is the water is very dark and deep. And to replace, and if you put a speaker underwater, it's not going to last for 50 years. It's probably going to need quite regular maintenance. Now, nuclear power is the safest form of energy generation per megawatt. That's the case, provided that you count for like the mining issues for things like solar. But it's a very, very, very safe form of power. Problem is, if you were to get professional divers to dive underwater to repair speakers and do that maybe every year, probably over the 50-year period, one of them wouldn't come back. And it's too dark to use drones, so you'd lose your reputation as being a really, really safe thing to save maybe some fish. Doesn't seem great. And, EDF have been trying to get out of doing this ever since they put in their planning application naively. Maybe they'll succeed, but the very process to do it is something that's dragged on for maybe 5-6 years. There was also a case around dumping mud. So to build a nuclear power station, you need a water supply, and to do work near somewhere like Hinckley, where you've got a lot of, you've got very deep water, you need to do some dredging. Now that means you need to dig out a load of mud and dump it somewhere. Because the mud is near another nuclear power station, some people decided that it was radioactive mud. Now, legally, I don't think it meets the definition of radioactive, but it's very, very, very low levels of radiation. I think being exposed, having it near you would expose you to about as much radiation as about eating about 25 Brazil nuts. Very, very small amount of radiation. And there's loads of radiation just around us always. Because
Well, I mean, going on a plane, right? Going on a plane, it kind of gives you a massive shock of radiation, and we do that all the time.
Exactly. And they wanted to dump it in designated mud dumping site in Cardiff. These are things, they exist. I mean, if you want to dredge something, you need a mud dumping site. But then there was a legal case to try and stop them and loads of delays. So then kept dragging on. So they said, okay, we'll dump it in a different mud dumping site in Portishead. And they actually got taken to court.
Don't dump your mud here.
What, by the mud dumpers?
By people who were sort of saying, well, we don't want radioactive mud dumped near us. Court case pretty soon realised, like, well, this isn't radioactive in any meaningful way, more than a banana. You wouldn't say a banana is radioactive, even though it's much more radioactive than this mud. And so eventually they decided to dump it there, and it all got done. But that delayed production quite significantly, because you had the months lost to the court case. But the problem with building something is you can't really build in all weathers. Like, if it's absolutely chucking it down, you're not going to get much work done on a building site.
Well, I mean, that's the reason you have mud dumping season, right?
So when you miss this window, it can have really big knock-on effects in terms of the ability to open a nuclear power station on time. And one of the fun things about Britain is that if you want to take someone to court on the grounds that they're going to illegally dump some mud, even if they're not, you have lots of special legal protections. So one thing is, if I were to sue you because I thought your house looked stupid and I thought it was causing me, like, declining my property value, even though I had no grounds to do this, and you won that case, you would be able to countersue and make me pay for your legal costs.
Well, even though my house was stupid and...
I mean, I don't think that's against the law, potentially. Maybe it is. But, in some sort of absurd case, right, where someone takes you to court on bad grounds, you can then countersue and get that money back.
Right, sure.
Now, when you make your grounds, and in this case, stupid grounds, environmental grounds, it means that you benefit from a cost protection cap. So your legal fees, if you're Hinckley and you're countersuing me, you can only get 5k back if it's an individual, or 10k if it's a NGO.
So there's very low risk for them filing effectively spurious and obstructive claims.
Exactly.
Right, sure.
And
A better system would punish NIMBYs with a delivery of 1 kilo of radioactive mud to their pristine front gardens.
and this is a sorry, I've been headbutting the
No, surely it'd be in their back gardens.
No, that's where you take it from.
You take it from their back gardens, make it radioactive, and dump it in their front.
Oh, this is got
Let's be clear that this mud isn't radioactive.
No. But
This is a hypothetical story where the mud is radioactive.
I'm suggesting creating some real radioactive mud.
And this is a problem with lots of projects. So there was a road that's being built currently, a very large road project by UK standards, and it's got the amazing name. I think it's the A something or other from Black Cat to Caxton Gibbet, which is basically the name, I think, of 2 roundabouts, which are highly congested. And we were actually talking about gibbets earlier before we recorded this show. And a gibbet is a medieval or Middle Ages-y sort of torture device where you'd put someone in a cage and you'd burn them to death, and this place is named after it. But maybe they never existed in Britain.
Good one.
Yeah, and it's one of those sort of things where it's like,
and
you go to the Tower of London, you go to like the Dutch Torture Museum, and they have all these like torture devices. They're all completely fake. There's no record of the pair of anguish actually being used. Use your imagination, listener. That's what they did.
I thought it was that they would just like hang them outside. You would just hang in a gibbet.
Yeah, and I think
Gibbet, isn't it?
Gibbet,
yeah. And
the Anglo-Saxon.
But I don't actually think it was that common, and whether they actually did it on that site. But there is a little gibbet out there, but this is a very congested bit of motorway.
Because everyone's rubbernecking to watch the to look at the condemned man.
To be clear, it's not a Stonehenge style scenario where this incredibly important road is also by a tourist site where people try to drive as slowly as possible to really ruin your trip to Devon.
Yeah, on what is a single carriage road, isn't it?
Everyone slows down to see the skeleton in the cage. Bonehenge.
But I mean, this is a really popular project amongst locals, right? Like all the local MPs supported it. We talk about NIMBYs, but fundamentally most people wanted this project, if not in their backyard, in their immediate vicinity, because it meant that they could get to places quicker, that when various roads got blocked up, it didn't all spill out onto their local roads. And as a result, the government put in their road investment strategy. They put a lot of money into it, but once it got planning permission, someone took it to court on the grounds that they hadn't factored in the carbon impact. They had multiple times, but it led to, I think they had about a bunch of appeals to try and go through that, and so that knocked them back about a year.
Whether, as in the claimant,
yeah. So the claimant was sort of said like, "I'm suing you," and it's like, well, looking at it on the papers, I'm not going to bring this to court. And then you're like, well, I'm going to still try again. So then they have a hearing, and then they try again, and all of this adds months and months and months, and eventually, they pay for their legal fees. And they might pay about 5k to National Highways at some point. But fundamentally, they've got very low costs. And then you miss the weather window. And all of a sudden, a project that should have opened 1 year won't open till a year later.
Right. So for 5k, you can cause millions of pounds of slowdown.
Exactly. As long as you have grounds that are like not wholly without merit, which is a very high bar to reach, you can basically cause all sorts of chaos with infrastructure projects. And part of the problem is our infrastructure planning policy is very out of date in a lot of cases. It's now being put back into date, but lots of the documents that inform whether or not you should say yes or no to a project were written before we did things like made a bunch of environmental commitments around Brexit, when we made a lot of climate change commitments around 2019. All of those sort of things aren't factored into those documents, or they weren't until recently. And that meant there were loads of grounds to chance your arm in a legal case, and people can just sort of sue projects, and maybe they'll go ahead, but they'll be delayed and they'll be more expensive, and you might think twice.
Nuclear power is not necessarily the most popular form of energy, but it seems that its advantages are obvious. It doesn't produce carbon, it works all day, every day without needing batteries, and it fries only a very tolerable number of fish. Clearly, we need to make it work in this country, but how can we make it viable, Sam?
So one thing I think we should do is, where other regulators that we respect, like the American regulator, like the EU's regulators, say a design is safe, we shouldn't then make them go through the exact same process to prove they're safe in the UK. We should try and minimise the number of design modifications. There's work underway in the Department of Energy to do something like this. I think it could go a lot further and just say, look, if you're approved in the US has crazy high standards. You're probably going to be completely way too safe in the UK too. So let's just do that rather than doing all of this excessive paperwork and all of these design changes that will add up costs later and force us to produce more power from dirtier or less reliable sources of energy. So that's one big thing. But I think there are lots of changes to make it easier to build infrastructure of all sorts that would help. So if you move to the system I was talking about in terms of environmental protection, where you, instead of having to prove each different thing that you're doing that has a minimal impact, you could instead make a very large investment, for instance, in creating new wetlands or contributing to a big government fund, and you don't have to produce that 10,000 plus page document. In the case of Hinkley, it was a 30,000 page environmental impact assessment. Then that would be a really positive step too. But then we also just need to be much more willing to build nuclear power stations as part of fleets rather than individuals, because if you have a whole run of programs, you have one project after another, it means you can train to be a nuclear welder and then you know that you have a job to go to afterwards. So you make that investment in training.
You can train to be the biggest crane in the world.
Yeah,
and you know you'll be able to put food on the table.
more than once. I'm sure Big Car will have taken across the motorway to
Buy an
suffer.
even bigger crane.
You'd have to be careful, I guess. Go. I mean, you might hit the Stonehenge sort of world there, and you don't want to knock one of those over like dominoes.
Well, they could pick Pig Cull would be best placed. I mean, there is
Sarsons will feel like dominoes.
There is literally no better thing in the world that could then pick them back up again.
Yeah, but it'd really ruin the mystery of how they got there, wouldn't it?
Well, it would add. That's I think the attitude that we need to embrace. That this is not an untarnished history. That we are adding to it always, and then if future historians can say, and of course that was the sarsen that was knocked over and restored by Big Carl.
So those are some of the things we could do, and I think the more we do to make building all types of infrastructure cheaper, by making that big infrastructure planning process much quicker, reducing the uncertainty, reducing the risk of lawsuits, that helps everything. But on nuclear, we also need to, modernise our regulations, make sure that lots of the debates that we've had around the safety of a nuclear project can happen at the very earliest stage when we're dealing with whether or not this design should go ahead. It doesn't then become an issue for public consultation. Those are some of the things we should be looking at.
I suppose as well, there's the point that actually by building these reactors, we are also saving huge amounts of other emissions, right? That actually by not building these reactors, we are choosing to continue emitting carbon emissions that it comes from gas production, from coal production, and just through sort of inactivity for the sake of fish that would actually benefit more from having the reactor there.
Completely right. And even compared to other forms of clean energy, nuclear is much, much less land intensive. So, you might have to produce the same amount of power as Hinkley Point C, you'd have to cover a lot of fields in solar panels. So it kind of gives you an idea that maybe if you were able to release a lot more of that land, you could use it for nature protection. You can keep more of the countryside looking like the traditional countryside rather than tiled with solar panels, although I'm not against solar by any means, but it is a thing we should factor in. This is the most dense form of energy there is.
And the uplifting thing about all these ways of making nuclear viable is that they are translatable to different endeavours within the energy sector and beyond.
Exactly. If we can make it easy to build nuclear power stations, we can make it easier to build offshore wind farms or onshore wind farms or solar farms, or the grid connections that we need for all of these forms of energy.
Wonderful. Having put Britain's energy policy to rights, I believe we are entitled to a short break. We'd like to emphasise that this podcast is separate from our teaching and research roles. It is, however, part of our desire and effort to bring zero-cost information about Britain's glorious intergalactic future to the general public. In keeping with that theme, we'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Patriotic Greens, being composed of Brussels sprouts and great British beefsteaks, are nutritionally complete in every respect. New subscribers will be sent a radiation-proof pewter tankard for drinking on the go.
And we are back. Sam, for the benefit of listeners who don't live in grace and favour estates or hereditary castles, what's wrong with Britain's housing stock?
There's not enough of it. It's very old because we haven't built a sufficient amount since, I would say, for almost 70 years. We've allowed a backlog to build up. Because it's old and because there's not much of it, it also is very expensive to heat. Modern buildings are much warmer, they use much less energy, and too few of the homes we have built are not in the best places to build homes. So we're not building them near tube stations or train stations or busy bus routes. And so as a result, when people buy a house, they're typically not super near the best jobs or the best job opportunities they can go to. So they're stuck with long commutes. I'm sure there are lots of other problems, but those are some of the worst ones.
And what are the broader consequences of our failure to build houses?
Housing has become extremely unaffordable. To get a deposit saved up for will take an average couple earning an average income around about 13 years, even longer in London. Most people, kind of just sort of stop bothering saving because they never have any hope of affording somewhere where they live at the moment. And it distorts where people live and where people work. If you think that working in somewhere like London or Oxford or Cambridge or York, you're likely to be a lot more productive than the average Brit. Not just because people born in Oxford, Cambridge or London are particularly brilliant innately, but because being surrounded by lots of other bright people doing similar things in your field means that your business is more productive. Businesses can hire from a bigger pool of labour, which allows for much greater specialisation. And so because you can't move to these places affordably, because the benefit of moving to those places is eroded by higher rents because supply is almost fixed while demand increases.
Right, and our population is growing, right? With sky high levels of immigration, there is a massive squeeze.
And it's not just immigration; it's also internal migration. So, as people get richer, and as the economy becomes more focused around cities, people want more space, and they want to live, in London or Cambridge or near London or Cambridge or near wherever. They don't want to live, miles out of the centre, and that means that the property that's left in these cities becomes much, much more expensive, and that's bad for growth. It means people have less disposable income, and changing that, I think, is probably the most important thing we can do to get the UK economy growing again.
And with regard to nations that have faced this similar problem and have faced it down and actually potentially come up with a solution, you refer in your report to reforms in New Zealand, where they have fixed this problem, this seemingly intractable problem of not having enough houses.
Yeah, so lots of different places have been able to build enough homes that they don't have these housing crises that we do. New Zealand is interesting because they kind of are like us culturally, but also in terms of the planning system they have. And what New Zealand did to increase supply, it started in Auckland and then it expanded to 6 major cities, was they looked at the land near various major transport stops. So busy bus routes, I think underground routes or rail routes. And they took the land around that and said, if you're within walking distance of fast transport, you can knock down your property and rebuild it to 6 stories. And what this did was it led to a massive increase in supply. And, people say, well, Britain can't build 300,000 homes or whatever, because even if we did fix the planning, we didn't have enough people in construction. They saw a 60,000 person increase in the construction sector because people respond to incentives.
If there are jobs and there's opportunity, right, people will take them.
Exactly. And not only is this good for the environment because people don't have to drive to work and they don't put extra stress on our infrastructure, it also had a really important impact on supply. So one study looked at its impact on Auckland rents and found that Auckland's rents were around a third lower than they otherwise would be due to the policy.
And what sort of things do you and your colleagues suggest that we could do here? I mean, maybe are we implementing this, or are there other examples that are models for this kind of development?
So I would say, yes, we should copy New Zealand. It's both good for the environment and it's a good way to increase supply in the places that need it. We suggest in our plan, back to what we're good at, that we should target this policy into places where house prices are around 7.5 times income and where they have a clear housing shortfall. So their problem isn't that the incomes are too low, it's that house prices are too high. That would help. But also one of the things we're interested in is estate regeneration or estate renewal. Post-war, we built lots of council housing. In our cities, they tended to be very large estates. They tended to be sort of big towers, then surrounded by a lot of green space that doesn't really belong to anyone. It's not really a park. It's not really anyone's garden.
Well, the idea, right, was to free people from the tyranny of the streets, wasn't it? That was the kind of ethos.
And the problem is it meant that when we did it in our cities, we actually reduced density. And now these properties are old. They weren't particularly well built. And so they're expensive to heat now. A large proportion of them don't have any insulation. They don't have double glazing. And if we wanted to bring them up to standard and deal with all of the numerous problems, it would be very, very expensive. What we suggest is you take these sites, you build them at higher densities with private housing, you knock down the original buildings, not immediately, because people need somewhere to live in the meantime.
And they probably want to move out before you do so.
Exactly. But you replace that and you build estates at more of a attractive, gentle density, which would still be an increase in density. Now, in some parts, you want some towers, you want some higher levels of density. But what's important is that we do this a lot more than we currently do it.
So you're saying that actually we could have, rather than having kind of whopping great, and frankly, I mean, people don't like them, right? Ugly towers, you could have dense 6-story, is that about right? 6-story?
Yeah.
Townhouses for all.
Yeah, so you could have rows of townhouses. You might have some mid-rise apartment blocks of sort of 6 to 10 stories. You might still want to have a tower block, because if you can have a tower block in and amongst it, you can sell a lot more private housing, which gives you a lot more money to spend on your priorities.
And you can actually then, use that money to make the other places nicer and things like that.
Exactly, on all of these schemes to proceed, you need existing residents to benefit.
Well, and they when polled, these residents tend to be very much in favour of this kind of development.
Yeah, definitely. So, Samuel Hughes, who I think was on this podcast in the future or in the past, I'm not sure when the episode comes out, but he makes the point that these things pass with the North Korean style majorities. So you're looking at 80-90% on some of them. But obviously, to get those projects to pass, you need to offer the existing residents something good. So a bigger, warmer, nicer property. And the more you can increase density on these projects, the better the thing you can offer the existing residents, or the more council housing you can provide for people who are on the waiting list. So we're in favour of higher densities, and I think there are a bunch of things you could do to make that easier. Now, that's one big lever, and I think you can get a lot of homes in London and some other cities building that way. Another thing that I think is really crucial is taking places like Cambridge, like Oxford, where they are nationally important because they have such big contributions to our economy in terms of innovation.
Well, although, as an Imperial graduate myself, they are, trifling regional, parochial places in comparison to the science superpower in central London.
I'm told Imperial may have topped the table in the best university rankings.
A little bird has said so.
You can't really read much into these university rankings. I remember the Guardian university rankings gave, I think it was Dundee University, 20th place in mathematics, and they'd actually closed their maths department that year. I think it was Dundee. But, actually
closing of their mathematics department was the best thing that happened to mathematics. It was a great gesture of beneficence.
But, these places produce loads of innovation. People want to live near these institutions. They have spin out businesses that could employ a lot of people, but people can't live there because there's not enough homes. And when you put money into research salaries, all of it ends up going on higher rents because only so many people can live in the area. I think in these places, we should look at expanding them. There's a project underway that the government sort of put forward around Cambridge, but I'd be curious to see if something similar could happen with Oxford. And I think what's key is, we talk a bit about new towns in the media recently, but more important than new towns is actually extending towns. So when I think of what a good new town is, I think of Edinburgh New Town, for instance.
Which everyone wants to live in, right? It is the nicest and most beautiful part of the city.
And it's part of the city. That's the crucial thing. It's not two train state. You don't have to get on a train for 10 minutes, go through a bunch of fields, and then you get to the new town. It's an extension. And I think that's the crucial thing. It's going to be integrated with the existing infrastructure. And that's what we'd like to see. And ideally built to, attractive, gentle density, nice design codes, all the sort of pretty AI pictures you see on social media. That would be the vision. And I think that's what we want to see. And I think there are a bunch of things you could do to make that more possible. You kind of need to fix the way we regulate the water industry. So one of the big constraints on Cambridge is we haven't built a reservoir in a long time.
31 years.
Yeah. And you hear about Cambridge being the most water-stressed region of the UK.
Despite the fact when you walk around, if you step off a path, you sort of sink up to your ankles in bog.
And it rains, it's not exactly Madrid, but Madrid can fit a lot more people with a lot less rainfall. And the reason is we invented this amazing technology called reservoirs.
Holes in the ground.
You dig a hole, and then when it rains, the water collects in that hole. You store that water, and then when it's dry, you then use that water, or when it's wet, but you have a little bit of, as your sort of backlog for when it's dry, and it goes out of your tap. And this is groundbreaking stuff to some people, but
indeed, more evidence of the intellectual failings of Cambridge and
the magnificent Britons of the past who had the foresight to dig a hole in the ground to store water.
Evidence of the wisdom of
the world
of the QS university ranking
I'm
system.
Water stressed. I actually am. I've barely got any water left in this cup, and I've been speaking for quite a while, so.
Water everywhere, not a drop to drink.
Cracked.
I haven't
started this. It's fine, really. But that is something that we could change. So having a better model so that when you make this massive investment that loads of people want to put money into, doesn't require much taxpayer money at all, and it would be very, very profitable for people if you gave the permission to develop it, that they make some of the contribution to building a new reservoir in Cambridge, and that we speed up the way reservoirs are built. It shouldn't take as long as it currently does at the moment.
Well, the thing that I read about these Section 6 orders that developers have to build infrastructure locally is that a lot of the money gets spent on things like football pitches, that actually these new towns are then overflowing with multi-use games areas, but also have a hosepipe ban, and you can't have anything more than a kind of a sponge bath.
And this is why the football pitches have to be AstroTurf, because they'd be too dry otherwise.
There you go.
We now turn to a topic that will be distressing to many of our listeners. For this reason, I hereby apply a trigger warning to the forthcoming discussion, and I refer, of course, to the cancellation of the northern leg of HS2.
The bad thing.
For train enthusiasts like us, the bad thing remains a deeply traumatic topic. But we must not bury this trauma. We must process it. Sam, what went wrong?
The problem with HS2 and many infrastructure projects in transport in the UK is that we spend way too much to build a mile of track than our European counterparts. So the Tours Bordeaux line, high-speed rail line, was about 10 times cheaper than HS2 on a per mile basis. And, I subscribe to the theories of supply and demand.
Increasingly rare in this country.
If the price is lower, more quantity is demanded, right? People will build more stuff if it was cheaper to build. The problem is, for various reasons, some of them are, a planning process which empowers NIMBYs to require that we literally bury the trauma and do lots of tunnelling through the Chilterns. That's a problem. A degree of over-specification and an inability to sort of make prioritisation. So HS2 would actually be about 60 kilometres per hour faster than the European average. And what that means is the track needs to be straighter, it needs to be flatter, which means that it probably means more tunnelling, because you don't want to go through loads and loads of people's views necessarily, depending on the route. It means that you might need more viaducts. And all of this adds to cost. And I think part of the problem is we're not very good at getting a grip on costs. We're not very good at following the standard model and just doing that. We always try to do the most impressive thing. The countries that build cheaply tend to build the same thing again and again. They tend to build train stations that are much more bare bones.
Well, every station in the Madrid metro is identical, isn't it?
Yes. So they had a very, very, this is the layout of a station. We're going to do this. They chose construction methods that were much cheaper. For instance, they used cut and cover. We wouldn't do cut and cover in, I think, a lot of central London because it caused quite a lot of disruption. But they were able to do that. And these things dramatically reduce the cost of building. But there's lots of weird things too if you look into infrastructure. So I've been looking into trams. Leeds famously is the
Tom Forth. It's a futile project.
It's the biggest city in Western Europe without a metro system, so no underground or a tram network or anything. One of the reasons why trams cost a lot more to build in Britain than they do, say, in France or Germany, is when you want to build a tram, you're not just on the hook for putting the actual tram line in, you're also on the hook for all of the utilities underneath that might need to be moved. You pay 92% of the cost, and then the utility company pays the other 7.5%. And the utility company typically says, well, that's a really good deal. It means we can replace all of these leaky old pipes with new modern plastic pipes. So we're going to insist on a lot of diverting of the works because they get a free replacements, effectively. Not free, but mostly free. And so as a result, all of our projects move way more utilities than our European counterparts, and that adds cost. And that utility movement can be about a third of the costs. So it's like finding things like that and solving them is how we can get more infrastructure built.
Okay, and imagining that these were solved, what kind of network could we be enjoying? Like, what could our transport system look like in an ideal world?
This is going to sound really boring, but I think the priority, rather than creating new train lines or new train links, it's taking our existing train network and making sure that less of it runs on expensive, dirty, unreliable diesel trains, and much, much, much more of it is electrified. So about just over a third of our railways are electrified. In other European countries, it's closer to 50%. In Switzerland, the whole railway line is electrified. And if we could cut the cost of electrifying our railway, and I think we can, and I think there's a very good model, which is the German model, which is committing to electrifying the same amount of railway every single year from now until it's fully electrified, you tend to get good at things. The problem is we sort of don't do that. Every now and then we decide, we can do a load of electrification. And then we realise that there's like a bunch of weird UK-specific challenges based on how old our railways are, costs loads, and then we decide not to do another project. When in actual fact, we'd learnt loads of ways to avoid those costs. But
all that expertise is just wasted and disappears.
Yeah, there's like one old timer on the project like, I remember when we did that in the Great Western electrification. I wouldn't do that if I were you. And they're like, old man, we can definitely electrify this extremely narrow bit of tunnel, and that's definitely an efficient thing to do.
Let's zoom out for a second. Why is it important that we have cheap and efficient transport and that we're able to build more of it?
I think it comes back to the point around housing. We need to make it possible for people to live or at least work in our most productive places. And you can either do that by building densely in those places, or you can do that by connecting other parts of the country up to those places, so that if you live in a village, 5-10 miles away from the city, you can still get to work in the city in a efficient way. And that gives you many more job opportunities. And that's, I think, got to be the focus. And actually, that's why I kind of think electrification and making sure that our existing commuter rail networks are well maintained is really the key, rather than, you sometimes go online and someone's like designed their high-speed rail map of America, and it's like, no one's going to get a high-speed rail train from Texas to Boston. It would still take way too long. It'd be really unpleasant.
No. We're real train zealots here.
Well, we note that the Shanghai maglev travels at 460 kilometers per hour. Emulating those speeds would allow a Londoner to visit your beloved Edinburgh with a journey totaling less than 90 minutes. Surely an Anglo-futurist filled with the zeal of the Victorians can dare to dream.
I think fundamentally, though, when the Victorians built railway lines, they had good economic justifications. There is a degree of justification of connecting major cities because you can do better business travel. But fundamentally, what matters economically is that the area surrounding a city can be a bit bigger. So more people can work in the most productive places. That's what really drives it. And, that's why you got things like Metroland, where people did railway speculation. They said they'll buy up a plot of land and then they'll build a railway line to it and then build houses around that. We actually think that's a really helpful thing to do. And one of the things we suggest is for the restoring your railway fund, all these sort of ideas of, resurrecting the lines that were killed under beaching. A lot of them probably are not viable by themselves, but if you were to add a lot of housing around some of the stations, they might suddenly be viable. And changing planning policy to make it much easier to consent a railway and a bunch of houses near that railway might make a east-west railway or a Portishead to Bristol line much, much more economically viable.
I'm going to push back on your doomerism about high-speed rail, Sam, because taking your point about expanding the area of a city, surely if we graduate not just from HS2 but to HS22 or whatever it is, then London effectively becomes much, much larger and has access to perhaps several more million people.
Yes, but as fun as that might be, I think, we'd have to bring down costs a lot to make that economically viable. And I don't see that.
We just need to do more of them, don't we? I hear what you're saying.
So I think at the moment, the priorities are, one, we've got loads of rolling stock that's really out of date.
These are the trains themselves.
Yeah. So these are the trains, not the track or the stations or whatever. They're really old. They should last for about 30 years. A lot of them will be past that 30-year sell-by date. We've got a lot of rolling stock factories that are getting a bit sweaty ever since HS2 was cancelled, because they're like, I thought we were building a lot of high-speed trains for this, and you've seemingly cancelled all of those orders. So we should really be trying to make orders to try and... The Central line should have much newer trains. The Victoria line should have newer trains. Loads of bits of the north where they're using those sort of horrible pacer trains should be.
That roll into the station and everyone on the platform groans to see them.
Yeah,
2-carriage trains.
All of these things, I think, are my priorities. That and electrification. If we can bring down high speed costs, that would be brilliant. And, I'm sure there are projects, a London to Manchester line at French or Spanish costs makes a lot of sense. But unless we can bring down those costs, the scarce money we have to spend on infrastructure should prioritise getting diesel off the tracks and making sure trains don't break down as often.
But isn't this that actually we are suffering from the effects of this huge backlog? But once this is cleared, there is an exciting future of high-speed railway ahead of us.
It could be. I don't want to crush anyone's dreams. I don't want to pour cold water on it. Or
train enthusiasts have suffered enough over the past year.
But fundamentally, I think we need to think of trains as almost like a housing technology. A train is basically a way of building more homes in a city centre without actually building.
You've got this the wrong way around. Homes are vessels for us to get on exciting new trains. They are where we sleep in between these train journeys.
But that's got to be my focus: agglomeration, building up our cities, and making sure more people can work in them.
Sam, let's knit this all together then. If the government were then to enact each and every one of your recommendations, what would Britain look like in 20 years?
It would be somewhere where people earn a lot more because they could work in more productive places. It would be one where our energy system meant that we were more independent and that we weren't subject to the whims of what happens in the Middle East or in Russia. And it would mean that, transport was not just fast and reliable, but it was also much cleaner and would hit our environmental goals. I think it can be done. It's going to be difficult. It's going to mean that lots of people who scream very loudly when things change will put up a fight. But I'm quite heartened that I think Britain's political debate around building stuff has shifted quite substantially. And, even people who are clearly are NIMBYs have to say they're YIMBYs. They feel a bit embarrassed to say that, no, I don't want to, they have to at least have the boilerplate that I want to build things, but just not right here, please. Oof. And I think that kind of shift in the debate is really helpful. That's kind of the future for Britain, one where we're a richer country, transport is fast and reliable.
Maglevs everywhere, as you said.
Maglev trams.
Yeah, lots more parts of Britain have trams. I think that's a very achievable vision, and one that, France and Germany built something like 20 to 40 trams in the past sort of 20 years. Why don't we? Why can't we have a similar renaissance? We have the population for it. There's lots of places that, in France have a tram where their British equivalent it's not even on the horizon or even being debated about, but it shouldn't be. It really should be on the agenda. So that's the kind of country I want to see. And I think what's key is that in the past, we built things and people in the future benefited. And I think we need to come back to that and rediscover that sort of long-term, almost social contract where what we build we don't just build for ourselves, we build it for future generations.
It strikes, I think, both Tom and I, that your vision for Britain's future is actually, it's not radical. You're not, to our dismay, talking about building, gleaming viaducts upon which trains race across the country at the speed of sound. But actually, a lot of this reinvigoration comes from actually rolling our sleeves up, getting something done, and not resting on the laurels and resting on the work and growing fat off the work that previous generations have done for us. What extent do you feel that actually we have a responsibility to future generations to do this, to engage in this project of building?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the problem is that we've lived off the achievements of the past, but haven't renewed that sort of infrastructure base. We've not made the same investments, and as a result, we're getting much poorer as a country. We're falling behind other places. Not poor as a country, but relatively, we're no longer the sort of at the forefront. And I think we need to rediscover that spirit of invention and that spirit of actually getting down and building things, because that infrastructure is really needed, and future generations will thank us for it.
Sam, the cement mixer you brought into the studio has begun to slow. There are viaducts to build and train tracks to lay. We will let you head back to Earth, but before you go, please tell listeners where they can read your report and where they can keep up with your work.
So I'm on Twitter at Sam Dumitriu. I have a Substack, which you can find. It's called Notes on Growth. And if you want to follow the work of Britain Remade, it's www.britainremade.co.uk. If you want to read our plan, it's www.britainremade.co.uk/plan.
And we'll put these in the show notes.
Well, thank you very much for coming to the KC3, Sam. Good luck down there.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners, thank you for joining us. Now is the time for you to do your bits for king and country. With that in mind, rank and file listeners are invited to tell their friends and Twitter followers about this podcast.
And patrician listeners are invited to philanthropically support the show. In return, we will even name a wing of the KC3 after you.
We'll speak to you soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio. Goodbye.
you.